Today, I'm going to be telling you two true crime stories linked by a single theme. Both of these cases have final videos associated with them that have disturbing backstories. Now, we've done a few videos like this in the past, but this time we're going to be taking things a step further, because both of these stories actually have a second thing in common as well. In each of these cases, there were red flags that were either ignored or not taken seriously, that, if they had been acted on earlier, might have been able to prevent a tragedy. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told, with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. On the afternoon of August 26th, 2022, several drivers in Toronto, Ontario witnessed what they initially thought was a simple traffic accident. A silver Lexus SUV had skipped over the curb while traveling down a 4-lane road. The vehicle had managed to stop just before slamming into the guardrail, but it was now almost fully over the sidewalk, and it was clear that there were multiple people inside. Thinking that the driver had lost control or was experiencing some kind of medical emergency, multiple Good Samaritans quickly pulled over and went to try and help. However, as they got closer, what they saw immediately stopped them in their tracks. The moments that followed were not only horrifying to witness, but made it obvious that what was happening here was anything but an accident. Unfortunately, though, the situation was even worse than anyone realized. You see, this was a tragedy that had actually been simmering for the better part of 2 years. In order to understand how all of this happened, though, first, we have to go back. Early 2019 was a hopeful time in the lives of 41-year-old Elvie Sig-Od and her 17-year-old daughter Angelica. The mother and daughter were getting ready for a pretty important reunion. After many years, their family was finally going to be whole again. Now, Elvie and Angelica had already been living together for about a decade after immigrating to Canada from the Philippines. But for most of Angelica's life, their family situation had been pretty complicated. That was especially true when it came to Angelica's father, 44-year-old Godfrey Sig-Od. Elvie and Godfrey were married in 2001, right around the time of Angelica's birth. Back then, they were all still living in the Philippines. But sadly, it wasn't long before the young family began to fall apart. Based on the available information, it seems a lot of the difficulties they experienced came back to Godfrey. According to reports, he was a heavy drinker and was more interested in taking care of himself than his family. For instance, while he always seemed to find time to work on his physique, he wasn't the most involved husband and father, dumping most of his responsibilities on Elvie or on his mother. This frustrated Elvie, and eventually she decided that someone had to take the initiative to provide for them financially. As a result, in 2004, she applied for a work visa and managed to get a job in Hong Kong. Over the next couple of years, Elvie worked tirelessly, sending money back home and making sure that Angelica had everything she needed. During this time, Godfrey was supposed to be looking after her. However, once again, it was his mother who took on the role of raising his child. In the meantime, he paid Elvie back for all of her hard work by cheating on her constantly with other women. At some point, Godfrey would even end up having another daughter with one of these women. So yeah, as you can imagine, Elvie was devastated, but she continued trying to move forward in life. Though she didn't officially end her marriage with Godfrey, she considered them separated. And when she found new work opportunities in Canada in 2006, she decided to relocate there permanently. From the sounds of it, she went on to be pretty successful and eventually started her own business. Once she was doing well and had her citizenship, the first thing she did was arrange for Angelica to come and live with her in Canada. Over the next few years, the mother and daughter built a wonderful new life for themselves. They settled in Markham, a city in York Region just northeast of Toronto, and by all indications were very happy. On top of being a successful businesswoman, Elvie, who was a devout Christian, began training to become a pastor. Angelica, meanwhile, became your average Canadian teenager. She made lots of friends, played keyboard in the church worship band, and spent her holidays off from school working at a children's summer camp. Throughout this period, Elvie and Angelica had basically no contact with Godfrey. And for the longest time, this was totally fine. Though the pair didn't have any other family nearby, they had each other. According to Angelica's friends, she looked up to her mom more than anyone else in the world. Still, as Angelica got older, she felt a longing for her family to be together again. She dreamed of her mom, and her dad one day being reunited. Understandably, this seemed like a pipe dream. That was, until Angelica and her mother were contacted out of the blue by her paternal grandmother. She asked if Elvie would sponsor Godfrey so that he could come to Canada as well. Now, for obvious reasons, Elvie was incredibly hesitant to do this. She was worried that it wasn't a good idea to let Godfrey back into their lives. But pretty soon, he had reached out directly as well. He apologized profusely for how he had acted in the past and swore that he was a changed man. In the end, Elvie agreed. It wasn't so much that she believed Godfrey, it was that she knew how much this would mean to her daughter. This is where things were going into 2019. In January of that year, Godfrey officially arrived in Canada and moved in with his estranged wife and daughter. The hope was that all of them would finally be able to live together as a happy family. Unfortunately, though, that's not what happened. On November 20th, 2020, so almost 2 years later, Elvie Sig-God walked into the District 5 headquarters of the York Regional Police. She was there to speak to a detective about an incredibly disturbing incident that had taken place earlier that day. One during which she said Godfrey had threatened to kill her. So yeah, it turned out that Godfrey was not a changed man at all. If anything, he'd only grown more unhinged and selfish during his time away from his family. After arriving in Canada, he refused to help contribute to the household or to pay Elvie back for all of the money she spent on sponsoring him. Even more ridiculously, despite his past infidelity and the fact that he and Elvie hadn't really been a couple for years, he was insanely jealous and accused her of cheating on him constantly. It wasn't just Elvie that Godfrey was lashing out at, though. He was also incredibly disrespectful and resentful towards his daughter. Even though it was Angelica that initially wanted Godfrey there, he quickly destroyed any chance he had of a real relationship with her as well. Even so, for quite a while, Elvie and Angelica had tried everything they could think of to make things work. But for 22 months now, their lives had been a living hell, and it seemed like no matter what they did, Godfrey's behavior only escalated. The final straw for Elvie had come a few weeks before this visit to police, when what started out as a normal night at home took a terrifying turn. It happened when Angelica put a note on the refrigerator jokingly reminding her father not to eat all of the food, which apparently he often did. He responded to this by flying into a rage and threatening her, telling her something to the effect of, "Be thankful your grandmother was there when you were a kid, because if not, you'd have been dead a long, long time ago." By this point, Elvie and Angelica were so afraid of Godfrey that when they called the police and reported what had happened, they asked officers not to come to their home. Instead, they met them at a local park where they explained what had happened. The officers apparently told them that they didn't think Godfrey had broken the law, and so nothing was done. Worried about both her daughter and herself, Elvie kicked Godfrey out immediately after this and decided enough was enough. After nearly 20 years, she officially filed for divorce. Initially, Godfrey did what he always did. He was extremely apologetic and seemed to be cooperative. He left Elvie's house willingly and said he would sign the divorce papers. But that's what had led to this incident on November 20th. When Elvie went to pick up the papers at Godfrey's workplace that morning, he claimed he forgot them. He then flew into a rage in the parking lot, got in Elvie's face, and threatened to kill her. After sitting down with a York Regional Police detective that day, Elvie explained everything that had happened in an interview.
And then, so I went this morning there to collect a divorce paper that he said he signed already.
Yeah.
Because he got served a month ago, and I'm supposed to collect that documents. He's supposed to give it back to me. So I told him that bring it tomorrow, which is today, so I can come and pick it up at your work before you start work. Yeah, I went, and then that's when he said the threat that he wants to kill me, and then he wants to take my 2 eyes out.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I can't. Like when he said that, I started to shake. My legs were shaking, and then he came to my face And then I keep pushing her away, and then I told him that you must keep your distance.
You've turned around,
Yeah.
and that's how the conversation starts. Is he says, "I've been planning to kill you."
Yes, yes.
While it appears this report was taken more seriously by police than the previous threat against Angelica, ultimately, just like before, nothing happened. A warrant was put out for Godfrey's arrest for uttering threats, but he was never actually taken into custody, and the situation was never properly followed up on. It would take nearly another 2 years for police to realize their mistake. But unfortunately, by that point, it was too late. At around 3:30 p.m. on August 26, 2022, this cell phone video was recorded by horrified bystanders in Toronto's North York area. It shows Elvie Sig-God pacing around on the sidewalk close to a guardrail at the side of the road along a section of Bathurst Street. Lying close to him on the pavement are the bodies of his ex-wife and daughter. That afternoon, Godfrey had convinced Elvie and Angelica to pick him up and take him to a local government office so he could renew his passport. Only part of the way into the journey, though, he flew into a rage. Without warning, he pulled a hunting knife from his gym bag and began stabbing and slashing them. This is what I was alluding to at the beginning of this story. When Elvie veered off the road, initially other motorists thought it was simply some kind of accident. However, moments later, the doors of Elvie's silver Lexus SUV flew open as she and Angelica desperately attempted to make it to safety. Sadly, though, Godfrey was much stronger, and he proceeded to drag the injured and terrified women from the vehicle while continuing the vicious attack. Even after realizing what was happening, a couple of brave Good Samaritans did try to intervene. But Godfrey was still armed and made movements towards anyone who tried to stop what was happening. As a result, all anyone could do was watch in horror as Elvie and Angelica were murdered in the middle of the street in broad daylight. Throughout the chilling attack, Godfrey only stopped occasionally to yell at bystanders that Elvie had been cheating on him. When police arrived at the scene, Godfrey immediately surrendered and was taken into custody. Heartbreakingly, though, nothing could be done for Elvie or Angelica. They were both pronounced dead at the scene. It would later be determined during an autopsy that Elvie had suffered at least 14 cutting and stabbing injuries, while Angelica had suffered 19. Elvie was 44 years old, and Angelica was just 20. Following his arrest, Godfrey claimed to have no recollection of his actions and did his best to paint himself as the victim. He said he simply snapped and that he'd been driven to this by his ex-wife and daughter. In his version of events, Godfrey stated that while on their way to the government office that day, Elvie refused to give him back his passport and permanent residency card. She told him she wanted the more than $3,000 he owed her for sponsoring him to come to Canada, money which he didn't have. He said that the breaking point for him, though, was when he asked Angelica whether she had been sending money back to his mother in the Philippines. Godfrey claimed that she told him, quote, "I told you before, the only family I have is from my mother's side." That's when he went into his gym bag and grabbed his knife. He would later describe the situation in court this way, quote, "My anger just exploded. I was asking for my passport and Angelica was showing she had no concern for my mother, the person who took care of her. I was very, very mad. I do not know what happened." After investigating further, though, police found plenty of reasons to doubt Godfrey's story, particularly the way he described the situation as some kind of spontaneous attack. Upon retrieving Elvie's text messages, they learned that Godfrey had been trying to get her and Angelica alone for months leading up to the killings. Elvie had been serious when she said that she was done with Godfrey. Following that police interview in November of 2020, she'd gone ahead with the divorce, and she and Angelica completely cut off contact with him. From the sounds of it, they also moved so that he would no longer know where they lived. Godfrey had eventually figured out how to contact Elvie, and had tried his usual tactics of bombing her with romantic messages and claiming he had changed. He said she was still the only woman he'd ever loved and that he wanted to get married again. When it became clear that Elvie wasn't buying it this time, Godfrey changed his approach. He relentlessly worked to find some excuse to meet up with his ex-wife and daughter again, until he came up with the passport renewal. Since this was something Elvie actually would have needed to help him with, she went against her better judgment and agreed to take him. To investigators, all of this was a clear sign of premeditation, especially when they factored in the prior complaints and reports Elvie had already made about Godfrey's behavior. Her entire interview from November of 2020 took on haunting new significance, but particularly this part here.
When he said these things to you about he wants to kill you and wants to take your eyes out, do you think he's serious? Do you think it's something he would do?
Yes.
When the case went to trial earlier this year, it was clear that Godfrey still felt that he was somehow the victim in all of this and showed no remorse for what he had done. In between continuing to claim that he had no idea what happened on the day of the murders, he repeatedly blamed Elvie and Angelica for his actions. At one point, after being asked to recount the events, he stated, quote, "What I know next is they were all lying there and they were all bloody, and I was saying, why did you do this to me? This is the fate of people who are only after money. And then I was saying, you cheated on me and you were just after money." Godfrey actually attempted to plead guilty to manslaughter ahead of the proceedings, but in a rare move, the prosecutors rejected this. Instead, they went after him for first-degree murder. In the end, Godfrey was convicted of first-degree murder for Elvie's death, though he was convicted of the lesser crime of second-degree murder for killing Angelica. In March of 2025, Elvie Sig-God was sentenced to life in prison. He will not be eligible for parole for at least 25 years. I don't know about you, but it'll be a long time before I'll be able to get that footage of Elvie's interview with police out of my head. And I can't help but wonder if her and Angelica might still be alive today if her warnings about her ex-husband had been taken seriously and acted upon sooner. The summer of 2021 was an exciting time for 24-year-old Kylen Schulte and 38-year-old Crystal Turner. The two women were madly in love, they were recently married, and they were in the middle of building a new life together and planning for the future. At first glance, Kylen and Crystal might not have seemed like the most obvious couple, and in a lot of ways that was definitely true, especially on the surface. Kylen was taller, younger, and had sort of a carefree hippie girl thing going on. Crystal was shorter, a little older, and was known for her sense of humor, her love of steak, and her passion for motorcycles. But on a deeper level, the women had a lot in common, both through the things that they valued in life and in the way that they had each experienced more than their fair share of hardship. Kylen had grown up in Montana, and by all accounts, had always had a very outgoing and open personality. She loved animals, was into crystals, and was described by friends as a bright ray of sunshine. But in her late teens, Kylen's life had taken a sharp turn. First, she found herself in an abusive relationship that she struggled to get out of. Then, in 2015, her younger brother was killed in a freak accident. While tapping on a friend's window early in the morning, he was mistaken for a burglar and shot and killed at the age of just 15. Following the tragedy, Kylen's father, Sean Paul, suggested that they try and get a fresh start. They moved to Moab, Utah, and it was here that Kylen met Crystal. While out on a hike one day through one of the state's many beautiful national parks, the two of them crossed paths by complete chance. The connection was almost instant. Crystal and Kylen initially bonded over their shared interest in all things outdoors. They loved camping, hiking, and fishing, but it was more than that. Crystal understood a lot of the pain that Kylen was experiencing at the time. She had previously overcome her own battle with addiction and homelessness, so she knew what it was like to have to pull yourself out of a dark place. The more they got to know each other, the more they fell in love, and eventually, they decided to take the next step. In April of 2021, Kylen and Crystal were married in an intimate treehouse wedding ceremony in Crystal's home state of Arkansas. Their friends and family couldn't have been more thrilled. It was clear to all of them that this was the happiest either of them had ever been. Though the plan for the two women long-term was apparently to buy a house in Arkansas, before they could do that, they needed to save up some money. Because of this, they decided to stay in Utah, where both of them had jobs as well as a large circle of friends. Kylen worked at a natural food store called the Moonflower Community Co-op, while Crystal had a position at a local McDonald's. To keep costs low, and because they both loved nature, Crystal and Kylen didn't bother with renting an apartment. They had a van that they mostly lived out of, a 1987 Ford Econoline. They also frequently camped out at spots all over Moab and the surrounding area. So yeah, things were going really well for Kylen and Crystal, and they were loving their life together as newlyweds. Every day felt like an adventure, and it seemed like the only thing left to do was enjoy their happily ever after. Sadly though, that time would be much shorter than anyone could have imagined. On the evening of August 13th, 2021, so 4 months after the wedding, Crystal and Kylen went to a local bar in Moab called Woody's Tavern. It was a spot where they hung out pretty frequently, and like usual that night, they were there to meet up with some friends. A lot of the discussion that evening was about one topic in particular, Kylen's birthday. She was going to be turning 25 the following month, so everyone was excitedly making plans and figuring out how they wanted to celebrate. At some point, though, the conversation took quite a turn. It started when Crystal and Kylen were telling their friends about how their Ford van had recently been giving them trouble. Because the vehicle was essentially broken down, they'd been camping in the LaSalle Mountains to beat the summer heat. And over the last couple of days, they'd had a series of encounters with a strange man. At first, the women said that they thought the guy was just a little eccentric. When he first spotted them from his car, he got out and howled at them like a wolf. As unusual as this was, they said that they weren't threatened by it. In fact, Crystal even played along and howled back. But after leaving for a short time, the man returned with a bunch of supplies and groceries before setting up his own campsite uncomfortably close to theirs. Now, just to make it clear how weird this was, the area where Crystal and Kylen were staying was not some commercial campsite where you rent plots that are right beside each other. Even though they were only about a 40-minute drive from Moab, they were essentially in the middle of nowhere. The man's bizarre behavior didn't stop there either. The women said that he had been bothering them, and at times, it seemed like he was watching them. They referred to him as a creep. Understandably, when Kylen and Crystal's friends heard all of this, they were pretty concerned. They told them that they probably shouldn't go back to the campsite that night, and said that they were happy to help them make other arrangements. One friend offered to let them stay at her place. Another suggested that they park overnight outside the McDonald's where Crystal worked, telling them that she would even pay the parking tickets if they ran into any trouble. However, Kylen and Crystal politely declined. They said that they weren't super worried and that they were planning on moving their campsite in the morning anyway. On top of that, they had left Kylen's bunny, Ruth, behind in her makeshift enclosure, and they didn't want her to spend the night alone there. Before leaving the bar that evening, Crystal reassured everyone that she had a handle on the situation and that she didn't think the creepy camper was anything to get overly alarmed about. She told her friends, quote, "I've got my eagle eye on him." In text messages, Kylen also made light of the situation, writing, "If anything happens to us, we were murdered." While both of these comments were clearly meant as jokes, tragically, they wouldn't remain that way for long. Disturbingly, this surveillance video of Kylen and Crystal laughing and having a good time with their friends that night would be among the last footage of them ever recorded. 3 days later, on August 16th, Crystal and Kylen were reported missing to local police. By now, both of them had failed to show up for multiple shifts at work, and no one had been able to get a hold of them since that night at Woody's Tavern. This was very unusual. Despite their semi-nomadic lifestyle, the women were very diligent about staying in contact with loved ones. Kylen's dad, Sean Paul, was particularly worried, especially after he learned that right before his daughter and her wife disappeared, they had been complaining about a creepy guy bothering them at their campsite. It seems that by this point, Sean Paul was living back in Montana, and he wasn't able to immediately go out and check on Kylen and Crystal in person. So around this time, he called up a friend in the area named Cindy Sue Hunter. He asked if she could go out to their campsite instead. That turned out to be easier said than done. You see, Crystal and Kylen had told their friends the general area where they were staying, which they had said was close to Warner Lake. But no one knew the exact spot. So all Cindy could really do was drive around through the LaSalle Mountains, hoping for a lucky break. She would get one. But unfortunately, it only confirmed the absolute worst fears that had started to creep up in the back of everyone's minds. After 2 days of searching, on August 18th, Cindy caught a glimpse of something while driving near the intersection of South Mesa and LaSalle Loop roads. It was the sun reflecting off a silver SUV. As she got closer, she realized it was Kylen and Crystal's second vehicle, a Kia Sorento. The SUV was parked just off of a hidden road, and when Cindy made her way there, she discovered the women's campsite. The campsite immediately gave Cindy an uneasy feeling. It didn't necessarily look like it had been ransacked or anything, but the area was chaotic and things were scattered around and noticeably out of place. Kylen's rabbit, Ruth, was still there in her improvised enclosure and appeared to be fine other than the fact that she was completely out of food and water. But there was no sign of Kylen or Crystal anywhere. Throughout this time, Cindy was on the phone with Sean Paul. He was asking her questions about what she was seeing, and Cindy was describing everything as best she could. She said she was going to walk around some more and started heading towards a creek in the opposite direction of the roadway. A short time later, out of nowhere, Cindy would suddenly launch into a bizarre, sort of rambling description of the creek, about how pretty the water was and the beauty of the location. It was like she just couldn't stop herself from talking. Well, there was a good reason for that. Cindy was in shock. Upon making it down to the creek, she found the body of a woman lying motionless in the water. She knew in her heart that it was Kylen, but her brain was momentarily incapable of processing what she was seeing. When police arrived at the scene, they confirmed the awful discovery. And sadly, it wasn't long before they made a second one. Crystal's body was found under almost identical circumstances not far from the campsite. Making matters worse, what had happened here was no accident. Both of the women had died from multiple gunshot wounds, the majority of which were to their backs. It was clear that Crystal and Kylen's final moments must have been terrifying. The evidence suggested they had initially been ambushed at their campsite before being brutally gunned down while running for their lives. Though plenty of shell casings and bullet fragments were ultimately recovered from the scene, not much else was found in the way of physical evidence. It had rained multiple times between when the women went missing and when they were found, meaning that if there had been DNA left behind by the perpetrator, it had likely been lost. What was far more frustrating, though, was the motive, or should I say the lack of one. You see, there was nothing to indicate why any of this had happened. While Crystal and Kylen were both nude from the waist down at the time that they were discovered, there was no indication of sexual assault. And despite their campsite being in a state of disarray, nothing appeared to be missing or stolen. Of course, authorities did have one clue to go on. That story about the creepy camper Kylen and Crystal had told their friends the night that they were last seen. It turned out that they had provided a rough description of the man who had been bothering them. He was a middle-aged white male with a beard who had been walking around with no shirt on. Identifying this unknown man quickly became the focus of the investigation, and in the beginning, things were looking promising. In fact, two people of interest in particular would be covered extensively by the media. The first person you can probably guess if you think about the location and the time period. In the summer of 2021, it was impossible to turn on the news without hearing something about the Gabby Petito case. Now, technically, Gabby went missing after Kylen and Crystal were murdered, but there was significant overlap in the cases, especially as weeks began to drag on without answers in either of the investigations. When Gabby's body was found in mid-September and more started to be released about her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, many people who had been following both cases started to speculate about whether the murders were connected. It's easy to see why. The two investigations both had links to Moab, Utah. They had both happened around the same time, and they even shared some of the exact same locations in common. For instance, I'm sure many of you have seen that now infamous body cam footage of Gabby and Brian being questioned by police at the side of the highway after they were alerted by a 911 caller about domestic violence between them. Well, that incident had actually started outside of the Moonflower Community Co-op where Kylen Schulte worked. It also happened on August 12th, the day before Kylen and Crystal were last seen alive. There were enough bits of crossover like this that police looked into Brian Laundrie as a possible suspect in the double murder, but for a lot of reasons this line of inquiry was soon abandoned. For starters, many more developments began to happen in the Gabby Petito case, and as they did, the similarities between her situation and what had happened to Kylen and Crystal became less and less substantial. Also, Brian did not really fit the description of the unknown perpetrator authorities were looking for. The second person of interest that was reported on at the time was a man who had been pulled over for speeding just hours before Crystal and Kylen's bodies were found. This man caught the attention of police not just because of his proximity to the location, but because of his bizarre behavior. The deputy who pulled over the man later described his demeanor as, quote, almost a combination of euphoria and that he had been caught doing something wrong. He went on to say that the man's conduct was similar to interactions with people he'd had with untreated mental illness. But there was something about this guy that was so unnerving, the deputy didn't even end up writing him a speeding ticket because he didn't want to take his eyes off him. To top it all off, the man told the deputy he'd been hired to work at the Moonflower Community Co-op just a few days earlier. For obvious reasons, police felt like this man could have been the creepy guy Kylen and Crystal had been talking about, and the situation received a fair amount of attention at the time. But authorities later announced that the man had been ruled out as a suspect in the murders. Unfortunately, this is where Kylen and Crystal's case really started to diverge from Gabby Petito's. Because while more and more reporting and updates continued to come out about Gabby's killing, the opposite started to happen with Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner. Even at its peak, the case didn't receive nearly as much publicity or attention, and that only became true as the investigation ran into difficulties. Though police at one point had been looking into nearly 24 suspects in connection with Crystal and Kylen's murders, there just wasn't enough solid evidence, and weeks began to turn into months without any kind of progress. One person who refused to let the case die, though, was Kylen's father, Sean Paul. Amidst the unimaginable grief he must have been experiencing after losing a second child in such an awful way, he found the strength to push on and seek justice for his daughter. After traveling to Moab, Sean Paul set up his own clue booth in a public park where he appealed directly to members of the public for information. Not only did this tactic result in a bunch of new credible leads, it also attracted the attention of a private investigator named Jason Jensen. Moved by what Sean Paul was doing, Jensen reached out to him and offered to work on the case for free. It's not clear exactly how much assistance and evidence Jensen was ultimately able to provide to law enforcement, but what does seem to be true is that he was very good at keeping the investigation in the public eye. He conducted a lot of television interviews and became a direct line of information about the case to the public. He also ended up revealing one of the biggest breaks that police had been able to make. In March of 2022, Jensen announced that detectives had obtained an audio recording that had shifted their understanding of the timeline of the murders. That audio had come from a drone that was flying in the vicinity of Kylen and Crystal's campsite on the morning of August 14th. Shortly after 11:30 that day, the drone had picked up sounds that were determined to be gunshots. Jensen also said that screams could be heard in the background, though it doesn't seem that this bit was ever confirmed. The new evidence meant that Crystal and Kylen had almost certainly been killed in broad daylight the morning after they were last seen at Woody's Tavern. As disturbing as this was, it made many hopeful that police were finally getting closer to solving the case, something which turned out to be true. 2 months later, in May of 2022, investigators released the name of a suspect, Adam Pinkuziewicz. Adam was a 45-year-old drifter, and he was known to camp out in the mountains near Moab. At the time of the killings, he worked at the exact same McDonald's as Crystal Turner. However, that wasn't even the most shocking piece of information. You see, Adam was also dead. He had shot himself in a motel room in Waterloo, Iowa on September 24th, 2021, just over a month after Crystal and Kylen's murders. Understandably, this was a devastating twist for everyone involved in the case, because it meant that there would likely always be questions that would remain unanswered. Still, over the next few months, police continued to release more information. Here is what we now know. Despite the lack of physical evidence at the crime scene, authorities were able to find a substantial amount of circumstantial clues linking Adam Pinkuziewicz to the murders. This includes cell phone data tying him to the area, ballistics evidence, and surveillance footage of his 2007 Toyota Yaris, which was captured on video driving down the LaSalle mountain range towards Moab about an hour after that drone audio of the shootings was recorded. Perhaps the strongest evidence, though, was a confession that Adam reportedly made before his death. Detectives revealed that after the killings, he had fled Utah and traveled to Iowa, where he stayed for several weeks with a man described as his romantic partner. This man told authorities that Adam admitted to killing 2 women in Utah, and he was able to provide specific details about the murders that had never been released to the public. The man said that he hadn't come forward earlier because he was afraid of Adam. He also had no idea that Adam was dead until officers showed up at his home to question him. In terms of why Adam committed this awful crime, well, this is where things get the most speculative. But once again, we do have some idea of what police uncovered. During their investigation, detectives learned that Adam had a history of anger issues and was known for his volatile temper. When they obtained and went through his cell phone records, it was also obvious that he was a deeply disturbed individual. His phone was full of memos that included racist threats, paranoid rantings, and revealed his obsession with violence. In the lead up to the murders, he'd written about his ongoing impulse to kill, and the record showed he was also tracking random license plates of people he had seen. As far as his connection to Kylen and Crystal, as I mentioned before, Adam worked with Crystal at McDonald's, but the two of them did not know each other, at least not in any significant way. They worked almost completely different shifts and rarely crossed paths. That being said, the one time we do know they were in the restaurant together, there was an issue. Crystal had come in while she wasn't working and had made sandwiches for herself and Kylen. Adam apparently got extremely mad about this and complained to the manager. This happened just days before Crystal and Kylen were murdered. So, did Adam harbor some sort of a grudge? Well, it appears so. One of the other things that his romantic partner told police during interviews was that during his confession, Adam attempted to justify his actions. In the man's words, Adam said, quote, "He also shot them both because one of the women that was there was a woman that he worked with, and he didn't like her because she was bossy." Of course, this gets into something else which you may have been wondering about. And that's if Adam and Crystal both worked at the same McDonald's, how could he be the creepy camper she and Kylen told their friends about? I mean, wouldn't Crystal have recognized him? Well, there are plenty of people who doubt whether Adam really was the creepy guy, or if that was all just a massive red herring. Personally, though, I do think Adam was the creepy camper. For starters, he perfectly matches the description the women provided of the guy, and his mannerisms also seem to be consistent. On top of this, we know Adam was camping in the area at the time, and police have confirmed he bought groceries and supplies in Moab on August 13th, which is also in line with what Crystal and Kylen said about the man showing up with fresh supplies. In terms of why Crystal didn't recognize Adam, like I said, they basically never crossed paths or interacted at work. And during that whole incident with the sandwiches, it appears Adam never confronted Crystal directly, so she may not even really have been aware of how angry he was. The final element that often gets brought up with this case is whether there was a deeper reason behind Adam's hatred towards Crystal and Kylen. Because they were in a same-sex relationship, many wondered from the beginning whether this was some sort of hate crime. Obviously, that seemed less likely when it turned out Adam himself was gay. But, hatred is a strange, complicated, and sometimes irrational thing. And from the available information out there, it does kind of seem like Adam specifically had something against women in same-sex relationships. Around the same time that Adam started holding that grudge against Crystal, he apparently got into a heated argument with a manager at the McDonald's when she told him he needed to work faster. Now, I will say that it appears Adam got into lots of disputes with coworkers during his short tenure at the fast food restaurant, but this one apparently turned particularly nasty. Adam reportedly made a bunch of insulting comments about the manager's sexuality, who was also a woman in a same-sex relationship. So, make of that what you will. In the end, unfortunately, there are parts of this case that will likely always be a mystery. But at the very least, we can find some comfort in the fact that it seems that the people who matter most here feel like they've been able to find some sense of peace. That's certainly true for Sean Paul Schulte, who hugged members of the investigative team during an emotional announcement in December of 2022, notifying the public that Crystal and Kylen's case was officially being closed. In a statement, he said in part, quote, "It's great to know that he acted alone and that no one else will ever be hurt by this guy. The girls can rest in peace. I've been frozen in time for almost a year and a half, and now I can move on in peace. While this is certainly heartwarming to hear in its own way, personally, my mind keeps coming back to that surveillance footage of Crystal and Kylen from that night at Woody's Tavern. Would things have turned out differently if they'd listened to their friends? Or was this tragedy always unavoidable? Maybe that's a question, though, that's better left unanswered. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.